Everybody, thanks so much for listening. If you're listening to us for the first time, please subscribe, share this interview to as many people as possible. We have Ion Sancho on, former supervisor of elections in Leon County. That's the Tallahassee area of Florida. And he does amazing things still, even though he's the former supervisor of elections, still doing amazing things for voters' rights in Florida and even all around the country. And we're going to be talking about in our second part of this interview about 2004 through 2008 in those two elections. So, Ion, first of all, thanks so much for always coming on. It's an honor and a pleasure, and you do amazing work.
Well, thank you very much. You know, I've always told my constituents here in Leon County that I would have done this work for free, and you're paying me to do it. So I've had a blessed career. I love elections. I was raised in an environment in which our founding documents and history was drilled into me. My father was someone who cared very much about history. Evidence my middle name, which is Voltaire. My father's favorite philosopher, the individual who, when the French revolted against King Louis and stormed the Bastille and seized it, they disinterred the coffin of Voltaire and brought it into the center of the Bastille because that individual said there should be individual rights and the church and the state should not control individual liberty. That's the kind of person my father was. And I would have to say that he successfully transferred that love of liberty and individual freedom into me. And I like the way, I think that the Constitution that the founders created is one of the best documents ever written by humankind. They were flawed, certainly. We know that many of them owned slaves, but they understood their own flaws. There's a marvelous Ken Burns documentary going on now called Benjamin Franklin. And the whole point that Ken Burns is driving at here is this man always tried to do better. Benjamin Franklin actually owned slaves, but when he went to write the Constitution in 1787, his number one priority was to ban slavery in the United States. He wasn't able to do that, but you have a document which exhorts us to a more perfect union. The mere language tells us that our founders knew what they created was not perfect. In fact, our charge is to make a more perfect union, to strive for the betterment. In some ways, the whole concept that Benjamin Franklin was attempting to do becomes transformed into this document. This document is not set in stone. It can be amended. Why? To make those kinds of changes necessary to make a more perfect union. So again, this is where I found myself, and I ran for office after law school in Leon County, and the supervisor of elections blew up the election. So instead of going in the direction that I had planned, which was to teach history and constitutional law, I ran to fix the blasted problem that it was in my county. I will tell you, people thought I would just stay there and then run for a higher office. And I told them as long as elections were under attack, I couldn't do that. And in Florida, in my entire career, the Republicans never stopped attempting to suppress African American and Latino voters who weren't voting for them. And by the way, all of that history is encapsulated in the legal decision that came out, I believe on April 1st or April 2nd, in which Judge Mark Walker issued a 288-page decision in the case called Lee, who's the Secretary of State, the League of Women Voters versus Lee. And that decision really lays out the entire history. You and I have been talking about this history. I will tell you that reading this decision is like reliving every action that I took, because I opposed most of these actions. And so we had talked about the 2000 election last time. So let's just jump right into the aftermath of the 2000 election in the history of Florida's voting. And I can tell you right off the bat, stemming from the 2000 election, the Secretary of State's office was forced to admit that it had issued a flawed felons list,
Right.
a flawed felons list that had disastrous results. And there was nothing that could be done after the election, because as in the movie Recount, there's a brief little section there where there's a discussion among Gore's advisors. They can only look at ballots that have votes. Those individuals that were prohibited from voting and turned away, there's no remedy for them under Florida law or national law. But once the Secretary of State was forced to admit that they had illegally disenfranchised somewhere up to 18,000 African voters in the 2000 election, and let me remind your listeners, it was a race that was decided by 537 votes, and the Secretary of State's, Catherine Harris's office, admitted that they issued a list which illegally disenfranchised possibly 18,000 voters. 96% of them were African-American voters, and they voted for Gore. But there's nothing you could do about that. This list, which was deliberately released, was never investigated by the Bush administration because he was elected president. And the Justice Department never investigated what the U.S. Civil Rights Commission found out about this flawed felons list. It's discussed in the case by Judge Mark Walker. He points out that 20 supervisor of elections that looked at this list saw that it was so flawed, they refused to do what the Secretary of State wanted them to do, which is to remove all those African Americans from your voting rolls. 20 supervisor of elections, including myself, refused to do that because we checked the list and we found that it was over 95% inaccurate. So outgrowth of that was, after admitting that, the state of Florida was barred from purging any Florida voters for 4 years. They could not purge anybody else until 2004. Well, in 2004, Jeb Bush's government released another purge list. And they had passed a law in 2001 making the list secret. CNN sued to get a copy of this list. And the federal courts, or the circuit court here, it was state court, struck down the law and said, give that list to CNN and any other legitimate media that wants to scrutinize it. And what they found was the list was overpopulated by African Americans. And interestingly enough, Latinos, particularly Cubans in Miami, were missing from the list because Florida, on their voter registration form, did not have an ethnic checkbox. They only had a racial checkbox. So they caught all kinds of African Americans, which are now supposed to be illegal voters, but they didn't even touch any of the Cuban Latinos down in Miami-Dade. So that list was struck down again by the courts. Again, this is similar, trying to use the caging process, which at this point, journalists from all over the world started picking up on the fact of what the Republicans were making these cage lists. And I believe you've interviewed someone on your program that actually made a point of examining those lists.
Right.
A journal, yes.
Greg Palast, right.
Greg Palast and I had many discussions as he was digging deep into those lists, and he could see what the Republicans were doing. And he wrote a couple of books about this. Mm-hmm. And I had the pleasure of introducing him to a group in Tampa at the University of Tampa at a presentation he made. But so this continual use of the purge list to falsely identify people, because if you had committed a felon, you're barred from voting for life in the state of Florida. And that's a residue, by the way, of the constitutions that passed right after the American Civil War. The Southern states wrote new constitutions looking for ways to make sure that African Americans could not participate. And right after the Civil War, thousands of African Americans registered to vote. In fact, so many that in 1868, there were more registered Black Floridians than white Floridians. However, that's where the Jim Crow laws and consistent efforts went after these African Americans. And as Judge Walker points out in his case, by 1960, in a county in which there were 12,000 registered voters, the only minority county in the state of Florida, Gadsden County, there were 7 Black registered voters. The laws were so effective in keeping African American voters off the rolls that you only had 7 that were here. And the history is awful. It's awful. In 1920, for example, there was a riot in the city of Ocoee, which is just outside of Orlando. That riot started because an African American, Junius Perry, had the gall to attempt to vote. He was turned away from the polls, and he came back with friends, and then a large crowd formed, and then they proceeded to kill and exterminate and drive out every African American in the city of Ocoee. And up until 1956, there was a sign outside that city on Highway 50 saying, whites only community. This is why we had to have the Voting Rights Act, which in 2013, the Republicans gutted by their appointments to the Supreme Court. But anyway, so in 2004, they tried the same thing with a flawed felons list that was struck down again.
Okay.
Then you had, it continued. You also had these lists go all the way through until today. And it's a constant struggle. We finally forced the state to give us being the election supervisors of each county, all the supporting documents. If you want us to remove a voter, you give us the document from the clerk of the courts, which is the execution of conviction record. Unless you give us that record, we don't trust you no more. And so the process has become better with identifying felons. But then the Republicans moved to another target, and that target was early voting. I was the individual that brought early voting to the state of Florida. There was no such thing when I was elected in 1988. But in the very first presidential election that I had in 1992, an advocate of citizen participation, bought ads on both television and radio, and I used direct mail to the voters. And we had an 82% turnout of our registered voters. A shockingly high turnout, more than a dozen percentage points higher than anything had a turnout like that in the last 10 years. But I didn't have enough room to handle all those voters. We had hour-long waits in some of our bigger precincts. So I had to have another way to get all of these votes in. And I went to Texas to attend a conference in 1992. And that the Republican Secretary of State was boasting about early voting in Texas. And people could go to these early voting sites at suburban shopping centers and vote. And I said, that's a really good idea. And I found a provision in Florida's law called in-office voting that didn't have any definitions. Now, here's the advantage of being a lawyer. I have a law degree, never took the bar, so all I have is a law degree. But I understand that if you're a constitutional officer, which is what the supervisor of election is, unless the legislature tells you you can't do it, if you have a rational basis, you can do it. And since there was nothing in this in-office voting that barred citizens from bringing their ballots in and dropping them off and having them counted, I started advertising in-office early voting. And we had that. And then that proved very popular. And the Florida legislature approved Leon County's instructions for it and made it voluntary in 1998. And in 2002, after the debacle in the 2000 election, it was made mandatory. you will have in-person early voting sites. And they were 2 weeks before the election day, and it was really great. And then the Republicans saw that large numbers of Democrats, particularly African Americans, were using that, and they went after early voting, hammer and tongs. Again, as Judge Walker clearly points out, when Senator Scott, who then ran for governor and got elected, when he was elected, he got a House Bill 1355 passed. 1355 was not authored by the Secretary of State. In fact, the Secretary of State never even saw the election law. This bill was authored by the General Counsel of the Republican Party. He wrote the bill, had it introduced, and the Secretary of State was meeting with myself and a group of supervisors the day it was introduced in the chamber. And I asked him about it, and he said, I'm clueless, Ian. I've never seen this. This was not something that came from the elections office. No, it came from the Republican Party. And what they did was they assiduously studied when African Americans voted, and they proceeded to strike those days and those days only. They found, looking at the data, for example, that more African Americans than white folks voted in the first 5 days of early voting. Those first 5 days were cut. Then they noticed that on the last day of early voting, on that Sunday, more African Americans voted than white voters. So they cut off that last day of Sunday. So they just kept the central portion of early voting, 8 days, and that was all you could use. Well, and that did have a negative impact on African American voters. But the law of unintended consequences rears its head once again, because there was a group that was particularly eager and liked early voting, and it was Cuban Republicans in Miami-Dade County. They liked the idea that they had the convenience of 2 weeks to pick any day and go in and drop in their vote. And when it was cut, Ann Navarro, who was a state committeeman for the Republican Party, complained bitterly. She said, what are you doing? My community, my Cubans, and this is a Republican talking, we love early voting. So when the 2012 election cycle came again, there was a 5% reduction in African American voters because they couldn't use the early voting. There was a massive increase in Cuban Republicans that crossed party lines. And Obama picked over 100,000 extra votes that he didn't get from Miami-Dade in 2008. He got them in 2012 because those individuals were punishing the Republicans for cutting off the early voting and convenient voting for them. So again, early voting was targeted. In 2006, for example, I wrote a Braille sample ballot. We had individuals in my jurisdiction who couldn't read. Okay, I was asked by some members of the non-sighted community, could you do me a sample ballot in Braille? Well, again, there was no law prohibiting it, so I did. We had it translated into Braille. We had sample ballots and real ballots. Guess what the legislature did the next session after that November? They banned them. They banned, no supervisor could do sample ballots in Braille or Braille ballots. Illegal. You know, it's like, excuse me? What's the rationale for this? But again, access is going to be tightly constricted in the state of Florida and has been since the 2000 election. Again, we're talking about what was, let's jump right into vote by mail, because that brings us into the modern era, because these battles on early voting continue all the way through. These battles.
Well, I did want to get into that Diebold issue in 2004 and 6.
Yes. Well, what happened was after the disastrous 2000 election, hearings both in the state of Florida and at the federal level identified that we were using technology that was so old that it was invented by Thomas Edison, 1880s. Those are the lever voting machines used in a number of smaller jurisdictions in Florida. They were used in Ohio pretty extensively, New York. These are the machines that were invented. And here's the joke. These lever voting machines were invented because it was too easy to cheat on paper ballots. You can stuff paper ballots if you have, party member overseeing the ballot box or working in the office. So that's why the lever voting machine was invented, to stop the fraud that was multiplying through paper ballots. And of course, those of you who are reading the story, seeing today's newspapers, Republicans are saying, well, we want to get away from these bulky electric voting machines. Excuse me, you don't know history, buddies. That's the easiest thing to cheat on, is paper ballots. And that's the history of paper ballots in this country, which I could go on at length, but let's just say that's why they went to mechanical voting machines, to try to cut down the cheating, which was not necessarily successful, because if you paid the programmer of the mechanical voting machine, you could alter the results just like you could by paying the guy who was stuffing the paper ballot box. So anyways, two journalists from Great Britain called my office, and they said, I won't go into their names now, but they said, we've been doing investigations on the D-Ball voting machine being used in Great Britain, and we think there's a problem with that device. You use that device in your county, and you have a reputation for being open and innovative. We would like to run a test in your county. We believe that we can cheat on your voting machines, and you would never know about it. Well, that's a mighty big charge to make. But the kind of person I am is, okay, I want to know. I want to know if what they're telling is the truth. So Bev Harris, who ran an outfit called Black Box Voting, recruited a couple of scientists, a fellow by the name of Thompson and another out of Massachusetts, another fellow by the name of Hari Hursty, who is now quite famous. And they came in to do a security examination of my voting system. They looked at it, studied it. We gave them no passwords, no keys. And Hari said, I believe that your machines are vulnerable. And I asked him, how do you come to that conclusion? He said, because when I had your employee turn on the voting machine for me, it didn't immediately turn on. It turned on after about an 8-minute delay or 8-second delay.
Oh.
He said that told him that somewhere in this device, this machine was seeking instructions. So he said, somewhere in this device, there is something that's telling this voting machine precisely what to do. Well, he discovered it. It was called the memory card. You know how you have, let me bring it to something that some people might recognize. You have a camera, a modern camera, not one that using film, but say an electronic that takes the images on JPEGs, okay? That's supposed to be completely empty. There are no other JPEGs on there, no other pictures on there. You put that empty card into your camera and you can fill it up with pictures. That's what we were told the memory card was. It was blank. Well, Hari found a technology in Europe called a crop scanner, and it could read the memory card that the results were supposed to be stored on. When he put it into his crop scanner, that device showed clearly that what was inside the memory machine was a mathematical language called AccuBasic script, which consisted of positive and negative integers, such that you could preload the card. And what he did was he preloaded the card with negative integers. And when we ran the card through, it said there are 0 votes here. Why? Because he had balanced the negative and positives out so they were negative, but they were preloaded with more numbers.
Yeah.
And so we did a test. We did 2 tests. The first test, he changed the results of a high school election. He took an election that we had done, and in Leon County, we started a program where every school, we do their school elections. We do this to get the students to practice filling out the ballot properly. So when they run student council, student government, I bring my voting machines down to your school. You'd be voting on the ballot, filling in the ovals. And so what we did is he took an old election for student president of Leon High School, and then he changed the integers on the memory card and flipped the race. And then he did one further thing. He gave me a card that was supposed to come up with zeros on the morning. It's supposed to have no votes. When I put the card in and turned it on, it said, "Is this real or is this Memorex?" Which identifies the time frame we're talking about.
Right.
But anyways, we were stunned. How this card's supposed to put out a tape that just has numbers and zeros on it, names and zeros. And he was able to manipulate it to make it do anything he wanted. And at that point, I reported that to the company. I said, because the machines that Diebold sold, they were sold on the basis that nothing could be done to this machine without leaving a record in an audit trail that you could catch whoever did it, which turned out to be false, because it turns out that the Diebold machine was built on a really cheap Microsoft database that was obsolete. And so if you had a Microsoft native program on your computer, such as Notes, it could go from Notes and around all of the walls directly into the database. None of their so-called protections were effective.
Right.
I reported this to the company and they were really mad at me. They threatened me, and then they said, "You cannot use any of our equipment anymore. Forget it. We're not giving you the necessary updates for you to do any elections in 2006. And that was critical because legislation had passed requiring that you had to have certified machines by 2006 January. Diebold wouldn't sell me the updates then. They cut me off. They cut me off. Well, interestingly enough, the Florida representative for the other major vendor in the state of Florida, ES&S, they've been after me for years for me to be their customer, because we had a reputation of being innovative, quick. We use new technology. The first Windows voter registration system was developed in my office, and that's where it was betaed. And then now everybody in the entire state uses it, and now Windows-based voter registration systems are commonly used everywhere in the country, but they weren't used back in then. So anyways, ES&S said, "We want you to be our customer." And we arranged for a contract. I was going to switch over and be their customer. So it didn't make any difference to me that Diebold had said, "Screw you, we're not going to let you use our updates," because ES&S said, "We'll hire you." Well, during the Christmas holiday before January 2006, I get a call from the representative from ES&S. They want to put me on the phone with the president of ES&S. And so we had this call, and he said, "I want you to tell me about this hack that you did with Diebold." I explained to him, and he says, "Well, I don't think we can sell you our voting machines." And they refused to sell me their voting machines. Well, now there's only one other company that can sell voting machines in the state of Florida, only one other, and that was Sequoia. So I called up the Sequoia representative, and he said, "Sure, we'll sell you our voting machines." Then I get a call within 48 hours back from him and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have any voting machines to sell you." So I was blacklisted by all of the voting machine vendors because I had done the first, and it turns out the only independent test of a voting
Yeah.
machine, independent from the vendors. And of course, I discovered the vulnerabilities, and they wanted me out. They wanted me gone. Diebold flew in their corporate lawyers from Texas and met with the general counsel of Leon County and said, we will sell you the update so you can use the voting system that you have if you get rid of Ion Sancho as your supervisor of elections. Which of course the staff laughed at them, because he's not under our government. He's an independently elected constitutional officer. We can't remove him all. And they picked up the phone and they called me and said, you won't guess what just happened. The general counsel's here in Leon County, and they're trying to get us to get rid of you. And they were joking about it with me. No, but they were clearly upset with me for pointing out that what they were telling election officials across the country was a lie.
Yeah.
Now, I will tell you, I believe they simply didn't know, because they didn't invent the system. They bought it from a Canadian company called Global Election, because they thought they were going to get a huge buy of new voting machines after the 2000 election. There were supposed to be $3 billion for the purchase of new technology. So Diebold, who had never done anything in elections, just bought Global Election lock, stock, and barrel and jumped into the business. And again, they ran into me, which is simply, I wasn't trying to destroy their company. I just wanted to know the truth. And these journalists, this stuff is being compromised.
Yeah. I lost you, Ion.
And I will tell you what two things saved my butt. The first was that the Attorney General of the state of Florida, a fellow by the name of Charlie Crist, who, by the way, is running for governor now, he was a Republican Attorney General then. But all of his staffers are my constituents, and I knew a lot of them. And his staff went to him and said, look, there's something going on here. Nobody's selling him equipment, and he's got bucks. He's got money. He can buy it. And so Charlie Crist sent out depositions to all three voting and said, he filed an antitrust suit against them and said,
wow.
I want you to turn over emails, documents, and phone calls that you have had about Supervisor of Elections Ion Sancho. That was pretty shocking to them. And then in California, a group of technologists that were working for the Secretary of State of California, a Republican, they had a technical experts group of scientists, and they called the Secretary of State's office, called me up, and they wanted all the particulars. What are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. You know, a lot of people were calling me up, and I gave them all the details, and I didn't think anything of it. 4 months later, I get a call from this professor, from this scientist that works at, used to work at the Livermore Labs, some famous labs that's actually, they specialized in nuclear bombs back in the 40s. And he said, Mr. Sancho, we need to meet with you. Is there any way that you can fly to San Francisco and meet with us? We have something that you need to see. So I said, sure. I was already at a conference in San Antonio, so I just made a reservation, boarded a flight, went to San Francisco, and they gave me a report. And this report proved everything that I said. They replicated my vulnerability. Not only that, they, being a whole panel of scientists, I did one experiment. They did a bunch. They found 16 additional vulnerabilities to the voting machine. And the state of Florida had been attempting to remove me from office for not having certified 2006 voting machines. They had already started the process, the legal process of starting hearings and essentially determining why I couldn't comply with the federal law to have certified voting machines by 2006. it was a hoot. It was a real hoot. I'm making light of it now, but it was probably the most stress, even more stress than the 2000 election. They were trying to take me out of office. It was pretty clear. They ordered me, for example, to show up on a Monday with my attorney to start the proceedings to remove me from office. Well, I contacted an individual who was the head of the Miami-Dade Election Reform Committee in Miami-Dade. She was also a Wall Street lawyer. But the Division of Elections in the Secretary of State didn't know she was a lawyer. They just saw that she was a troublesome activist in Miami-Dade that was giving them a problem. I walked over her name to the Secretary of State's office and turned in as my request, here's my attorney. When I got back to my office, they called and they objected. This woman is the chair of the Miami-Dade Reform Election Commission. She can't represent you. And I said, excuse me. She works for a Fortune 500 Wall Street firm. Her branch office is in Miami-Dade, and elections are her hobby. They were stunned and shocked. And so I walked in, and here's the other thing I did on that Friday. I proceeded to call all the media up and said the Secretary of State is having a hearing with me in her cabinet meeting room on Monday at 11 o'clock. I just gave them the time. So I and my attorney showed up at her along with a passel of the press. It just so happened, so she said, no, this is a secret meeting. The press is not invited. Well, it just so happens she ordered the security guards to physically grab the media and remove them from the room. Now, one of her security guards went up and told her, Madam Secretary, today is Public Records Day in the state of Florida. Do you realize what kind of negative publicity on the day that is supposed to be celebrating the free and open press and the records that should be made available to them? You don't even want to do this. You don't want to do this. And so she actually recanted, and we proceeded to show them all the evidence that would prevent them from removing me from office. They were making the claim because I didn't have the material by January 1st of 2006, they could remove me from office because I didn't have federally certified voting equipment. Well, federally certified voting equipment was a struggle all over the country. So I was able to find them a letter that the Justice Department, who's in charge of the law, I showed them a memorandum that they wrote to another state saying that it's okay if you don't have voting machines by January 1st, as long as you have them and within enough time to have the election in September. That blew the Secretary of State's case out of the water. They were trying to remove me because I didn't have my January 1st. And they said because the feds require it. And I had a letter that showed from the feds that it wasn't required. So they were like, that's not going to work. And then the press gave them all kinds of holy hell over what they were doing. And I got a lot of national coverage. I will tell you that newspapers all over the country started contacting me. And ABC National Radio put me on their program. I was on Sunday ABC News on the radio. But the most interesting thing happened with ABC News. It's one reason I don't watch ABC News anymore. And that is I got a call from the correspondent who had put me on the radio and was responsible for finding me. And she said, you have to talk to our corporate lawyer. And the lawyer told me, Mr. Sancho, we can no longer cover this story. Because those were the era in which all of the media, the rules about purchasing other media had just been relaxed. It used to be, for example, that there was no such thing as Sinclair Broadcasting or these other media companies that bought up a bunch of local stations. There was a limit on conglomerates. That limit was coming down. ABC News did not want to aggravate the FCC, which of course the head is appointed by Republicans, by Bush. They did not want to run any trouble. So they told me they were no longer going to cover this story. The Washington Post, however, and the Miami Herald pick up the story. And I have a great comic that Milt Morin, who is the cartoonist from the Miami Herald, he wrote a cartoon that appeared in their newspapers with the Secretary of State, Glenda Hood, and the voting machine lobbyists with black bags, and there's flies flying around their head, and they're trying to take me out. So I have the original cell blown up in my bedroom. But,
I just want to interrupt you. I was looking at how many secretaries of state were in Jebb's term as governor, and it was 7.
It was
That's
a
lot.
They kept, well, qualifications were not the issue back then. There were payoffs for people who had given them big donations. That's how that office used to be handled. Once the Republicans took it over under Jeb Bush, it changed from being professional, long-time career election workers. It changed to political appointees. And that's what we see all the way through up to including today. I mean, Scott appointed the wholesale beer lobbyist to be the Secretary of State, Ken Detster. His experience was he was the lobbyist for the beer salesman. He was the beer fairy that magical cases of beer would appear in front of the apartment doors of all of the legislators. That was the extent of this guy's connection to the legislators at this point. But again, we were able to show through the California scientists that, in fact, we were correct. And the new Secretary of State, David Mann, who was one of those 7 that was in and out in a heartbeat, he never had the graciousness to write a letter and said that we were sorry. What instead was, I got the form letter that every other supervisor of elections saying that information out of California has indicated, not found by Sancho or Leon County, information out of California has ascertained a security problem, and from here on out, one individual is illegal to program those voting machines. You have to have a second employee watching what the first employee is doing before you can program a ballot on this system. So that's how that process went. I was able to survive after that, and I got my Diebold was forced to give me the upgrades so I could use the Diebold system, because they had that antitrust subpoena from the Attorney General breathing down their neck. And here's the kicker on that. As long as they sold the equipment to me, everything that was in the file that the Attorney General had compiled is and will remain secret for all time. So I was never able to see it, because antitrust material is secret in the state of Florida. But if they had not sold me the equipment, I would have been able to get access to that stuff. But anyways, that was the Diebold test. We found the fact that there were vulnerabilities, that there was this language inside this card that nobody had ever told us about, and it could be preloaded. And by the way, we found out that the attack on me was being generated by Harriet Meyer's office, who was the attorney for President Bush.
Yeah. And she was actually supposed to be a Supreme Court justice, but she didn't make it through the confirmation.
No, she didn't. She wasn't too right-wing enough for the Republican Senate back in those days.
Right. But so, and then I want to end with this last talk because you did talk about 2004 through 6. In the next interview, I want to talk about now and then talk about the lawsuit with Mark Walker. But we'll get that in the next time. But just to finish off this segment of this interview, when we talk about 2004, obviously it was extremely close in 2000. We saw what happened, totally different candidate, John Kerry in 2004. Bush won Florida 52-47. Was that an issue with the candidate, Kerry? Was there issues with voting? Why was that so big compared to 537 votes?
There was an unusual series of events that occurred in 2004. Florida was hit by 5 hurricanes that year, completely destroying Republican precincts all along the southwest coast, Collier County, all the way up to Hillsborough County. All of those and many inland counties had destruction. The polling sites were destroyed in those counties by the hurricane. And what the Secretary of State's office did was set up special voting tents. So the election in the Republican areas that were damaged by the hurricane were run by the Secretary of State's office, not by the Supervisor of Elections. And we don't have a recount. They were never recounted. Florida never recounts its votes. Even the recounts that we will be getting into in the future are not legitimate recounts. When they tell you we're doing a recount in the state of Florida, they're telling you they're going to look at 1% of the ballots only. Any ballot that has a recorded vote on it, they're not going to recount. That's Florida's recount. And having met a number of people from around the country that were involved in 2004, I can tell you that one of the most disturbing things to me was that Karl Rove had a technician. Remember during the Bush administration how 2 or 3 million emails that were supposed to be saved in the White House? Well, this guy had an office in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And on 2004, there was a denial of service attack on Columbus, Ohio, the capital of the state of Ohio. The Patel Institute was a private company that did the results for the state of Ohio. At 4 o'clock, thereabouts, on election day, the individual that ran the election servers was approached by his supervisor and told to leave. Other people were taking over the job that evening. He left. But later on that evening, the state of Ohio was hit by a denial of service attack. And the state of Ohio's votes were transferred to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to another server, which is what happens when you you have a backup server somewhere.
What is denial of service for people that don't know?
Denial of service is all of a sudden you get an attack on your system and somebody's trying to flood your system and jamming it up.
Okay.
Okay, like the system is getting so many inputs, it shuts down. And it's called a denial of service attack.
So someone was trying to hack the system then?
No, not necessarily. They were trying to shut it down to force the transfer to another server. It was sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is where Karl Rove's IT director had his office. The results of Ohio in the 2004 election were sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Then they were sent back to Ohio for publishing. The same thing happened to Florida. Florida transferred its numbers to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to Karl Rove's IT guy's office. And They were sent back to Tallahassee. No recounts ever done. I have serious doubts in my mind that the 2004 count was accurate. But as there's no recounts, the Bush was in the White House, no Justice Department investigation, nothing happened. And one of the things that you may not remember was there was a gap. All results on election night were frozen. They were frozen for about an hour, and then they restarted. And many suspect that these numbers were cooked in Chattanooga, and then and that took about an hour to do all of this, and that's how we got re-election of George Bush.
Yeah. It's just incredible that no one reports on this or even does a deep dive into any of these issues, because I remember the exit polls came out in 2004 where Kerry was going to win Ohio, and I think Florida was close, but I think he was going to win that too. Again, there's all this suspect with Jeb as the governor of that. And then we even go back to Ohio with what was the issue with Ken Blackwell, who was the Secretary of State, and also like Catherine Harris in 2000 was the Secretary of State of Florida, ran the Bush campaign in Ohio. So we have people that are cheers of the Bush campaign in Florida and Ohio counting the votes.
And you have hit one of the major points. We need to have nonpartisan, professional election officials tabulating these votes. And people like Catherine Harris and the Secretary of State from Ohio, Ken Blackwell, they need to have nothing to do with elections administration, because all they could do is something negative. They are committed partisans charged with the responsibility of electing their candidate. Those kinds of individuals should be nowhere close to the tabulation of elections in the United States of America. And when we talk next time, we'll talk about how that's occurring right now.
Ian, thanks so much for coming on. Next time, we'll talk about the Mark Walker case. I do want to talk about the voter law in Florida, which has to do with the Mark Walker case in general. Governor DeSantis, we'll talk about 2020 election and even going into 2022 and beyond with 2024. A lot of action will be in Florida for the next couple of years. We have 3 people on the Republican side that may run for president, and Donald J. Trump, Rick Scott, and Ron DeSantis. Unfortunately, it's the tie, I think, for the biggest crook between Trump and Scott. Trump and Scott.
Just remember, don't say gay.
Yeah, don't say gay. Well, with that, who do you think is the biggest crook, Trump or Scott? That's the question.
I'm withholding judgment.
Okay.
I will tell you that Scott declared the Fifth Amendment over 70 times in the largest health care scandal in the history of the world. Yeah. And Humana, which he was the CEO, had to pay a multi-million-dollar fine, and he pled the Fifth over 70 times, and he then resigned, and they gave him a golden parachute. $300 million in stock options, a guaranteed 5-year contract for $9.5 million consulting every year. I'm sorry, this man should have gone to prison, and he's now our senator.
He's a criminal, and Trump might be a criminal too, but I think Scott's gonna beat. I mean, that's pretty tough to beat. I mean, as bad as Trump was, that's pretty tough to beat. Like I said, the only person that I think is worse than these guys is George W. Bush, because he murdered a lot of people, U.S. soldiers, Afghanis, and also Iraqis.
And 17-year war never should have happened. Never should have happened.
And like you said, if Gore won, which he did, and it was stolen away from him, I don't think we see 9/11. I don't think we see these wars, period. I think, we see a lot of prosperity that we saw from President Clinton, but, it is what it is now. That's unfortunately history. And unfortunately, no one's learning from their mistakes, Zion. That's why we're trying to have you on, because we started with Bush stealing elections. Then we went to Trump trying to steal elections. And who knows what happens in 2022 and 2024. So we hope people watch this and learn something, God willing. That's
Thank
the
you very
plan.
much, Rob.
All right, I